I made a family heirloom table for their new home. My daughter-in-law had it painted over and posted online. Fix this outdated trash. My son commented, looks better now. When I saw it, I did say a word. But the very next morning, she received a certified letter declaring the table had been legally tagged as. I didn't raise my son to be careless. I didn't raise him to forget where he came from, or who stood behind him when he had nothing. But the day I saw that post, I realized something had shifted in him long before I noticed. It started with a photo. My daughter-in-law Marissa had posted it late in the afternoon. I almost didn't see it. I don't spend much time online, but a friend from church sent it to me with no message, just the link. That alone made my stomach tighten. When I opened it, I didn't recognize what I was looking at first. It was a table, a long, rectangular dining table, 8 feet, solid oak, except it wasn't oak anymore, not the way I knew it. The entire surface had been sanded down unevenly and covered in a thick, chalky white paint. The legs had been stripped and stained dark grey, like something mass-produced trying too hard to look rustic. Then I saw the caption. Fix this outdated trash, now it actually matches our space. I read it 3 times, slowly, carefully. Outdated trash. That table had taken me 6 months to build. I made it by hand in my garage in Columbus. Every joint cut myself, every plank selected, measured, sanded. I used wood from an old barn that had been standing longer than I'd been alive. My father had helped me tear that barn down when I was a kid. That wood carried history, it carried him. I didn't just make a table, I built something that was supposed to outlive me. I gave it to them as a housewarming gift when they moved into their new place outside Denver. I paid to have it shipped. I told my son Eric that one day his kids would sit around it the way he used to sit at ours. I thought it meant something to him. Then I saw his comment under her post. Looks better now. That was it, no hesitation, no defense, no acknowledgement of what it had been before. Just agreement. I didn't feel angry right away, that would have been easier. What I felt first was something heavier, something that settled deep in my chest and stayed there. I kept staring at the photo, zooming in. The brush strokes were uneven. You could still see parts of the grain underneath, like it was trying to show through despite being buried alive. One corner had a visible dent, something that happened during shipping, I remembered. I had told Eric about it, apologized for it. He said it didn't matter. Now it was still there, just painted over like it didn't exist. Like none of it ever mattered. I didn't comment, I didn't call, I didn't text. I just closed the app and sat there in silence for a long time. That night I went out to my garage. I stood in front of the empty space where I used to work on that table. The tools were still there, lined up the way I left them. The smell of sawdust still clung to the walls. I ran my hand over the workbench and tried to steady my breathing. By midnight I had made a decision. At 7:12 the next morning, Marissa signed for a certified letter. By 7:15, she had read enough of it to call my son in a panic. Because what that letter said wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. And buried in the second paragraph was a sentence that made her voice shake when she read it out loud to him. The table had been officially registered, documented, and legally protected as a historical artifact tied to reclaimed property, and what she had done to it could now be considered destruction of protected material. And that was just the beginning of what I had set in motion. I didn't just stumble into woodworking, I was born into it. My father, a man with calloused hands and a quiet temper, taught me early, the wood tells you what it wants, you don't force it, you listen. That was how I learned patience, how I learned pride. That table, the one Marissa called trash, carried the last piece of that lesson. I'd been in Columbus all my life. I grew up in a brick house near the Olentangy River, spent summers cutting wood with my dad in a barn that had survived 100 years. That barn held more than wood. It held stories, birthdays, arguments, confessions whispered over a crate of apples. When my father passed, he left me the old barn planks in his will. That table was the culmination of decades of knowledge, decades of memory. Every knot, every groove, every mark told a story. My son Eric had grown up watching me work in that garage. He never took an interest in wood like I did, but he respected it until he didn't. He was always too busy with work, with Marissa, with life in Denver. I tried not to take it personally. I understood ambition, but I had hoped he'd recognize value beyond money, beyond aesthetics. I had hoped he'd see history. Marissa came into our lives when Eric was 25. At first she seemed charming, full of life, full of ideas. But charm can be a mask and ideas can be weapons. I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. I baked pies when she visited, offered tips for decorating the house, even tried to help with DIY projects. She thanked me, but never once did I feel she respected me. She respected the image I projected, the handyman, the giver, but not the work itself. That's an important distinction. Over the years, I noticed subtle things. She would rearrange Eric's tools, discard pieces she called junk, post pictures of their home online, but never include any mention of the effort behind it. She wanted control, and control, I learned, meant erasing the past that didn't fit her vision. When they announced they were moving, I spent months planning a gift that could survive decades. I imagined holidays, birthdays, family gatherings, grandchildren running their fingers over the polished grain. I made it solid, I made it beautiful, I made it theirs. And yet, in one Instagram post, she erased all of it. I didn't react publicly. I didn't call Eric in anger. I didn't make a scene. My silence wasn't weakness, it was observation. The kind that comes with years of standing in front of raw wood, assessing its weight, its grain, the way it would hold up under pressure. I needed time to think, to plan, to let the gravity of their actions settle in my mind. That night I researched everything: legal protections, historical registries, reclaimed property rights. By midnight I knew the table could be more than just a piece of furniture. It could be untouchable. It could make them accountable. And I knew exactly how to make that happen without ever stepping foot in Denver. I fell asleep with that plan burning in my chest, not out of spite alone, but out of a sense that something sacred had been violated. The wood, my father's memory, my own sweat and effort, they were gone. Not physically, but symbolically, and that strung far deeper. By the time the sun rose, I had drafted the documents, notarized them, and filed them with the state. Certified mail was the final step. I could almost hear Marissa's panic in advance. I could almost see her fingers shaking when she signed for it. And when she read it, she realized that the battle she thought she had won with a paintbrush had just begun. The morning Marissa opened that certified letter, I didn't get a call immediately. I didn't need one. I watched from a distance, like a hawk circling a field it already owns. Eric did call, later frantic, confused, but by then the seed had already been planted. The letter wasn't a threat, it wasn't a lecture, it was a declaration. I had legally registered the table as reclaimed historical property, tied explicitly to the old barn planks from my father's farm. Every detail was documented: the age of the wood, the origin, the history of use, even photographs from before I had ever touched it. Destruction or alteration of such property, as Marissa would soon discover, wasn't just rude, it was illegal. When I saw her post, I knew this wasn't about aesthetics for her. It was about control. She wanted to assert dominance in her new home, to erase the past and replace it with whatever Instagram-approved version she liked. But there are some things you don't erase. Some things demand respect, whether people like it or not. And if they didn't, I would make sure the law reminded them. I didn't stop there. I knew registering it wasn't enough. People underestimate the psychological effect of accountability. If she thought this was just another table, another decorative object, she'd treat it as such, so I documented everything. I hired a local appraiser familiar with reclaimed historical wood. I had it valued, certified, and listed in the state registry. Every piece of evidence tied to me, to my father, to that barn. It was airtight. I watched her Instagram story blow up. Comments flooded in. Wow. I love the new look, much brighter, looks so modern, and beneath them Eric's echo, better now. I imagined she expected me to be furious, screaming, or to shame them online. I didn't. I smiled quietly to myself. Silence has its own weight, heavier than any post. Then I sent a copy of the registration certificate directly to her email. Subject line: important, historical artifact notification. I watched her open it, saw the read receipt ding, and waited. The panic in her voice when she called Eric was palpable. He didn't understand the gravity at first. He thought I was overreacting. But when he read the wording, destruction or alteration of registered reclaimed historical property is subject to civil penalties, he went pale. I had escalated, yes, but I had done it legally, strategically. I had weaponized the law without ever leaving my city. Every step was deliberate, every detail calculated. By that afternoon, I was already thinking ahead. Marissa had posted another photo of the table still painted, still fixed in her eyes, but now the comments had shifted. People were asking questions. Wait, is that really historical wood? Did she just paint over something valuable? The social validation she craved was crumbling. I could almost hear her mental unraveling from here. The irony was sharp. She had wanted attention, approval, and control. Instead, she had become the center of scrutiny. Every finger pointing at her was invisible to the world, but very visible to me. I felt the satisfaction, but I knew this was only the opening move. Eric tried to call me that evening, a mix of anger and guilt in his voice. He didn't know whether to apologize for defending the paint or to beg me not to escalate further. I didn't answer. I let the phone ring. I let him sit with it. Because the truth is, this wasn't about punishment. it was about consequences, and they hadn't even seen the first one yet. By nightfall, I had begun drafting the next phase. It would require precision, patience, and a little psychological pressure, and I knew without a doubt that when it hit, neither Eric nor Marissa would see it coming. Because the law wasn't the only tool I had. I had history, I had strategy, and I had the one thing they could never paint over: respect for what lasts. I had expected panic. I had expected calls, angry texts, maybe even threats. What I didn't expect was Marissa's next move. She didn't just repaint the table. She posted another story. This one was worse. It was a video. She held a brush in one hand, a can of paint in the other, and she smiled at the camera. "Well, Grandpa's silly rules won't stop me," she said, her voice dripped with mockery. "Who cares about old wood anyway? Modern home, modern style." Then she laughed and swung the brush across the surface. I froze, my heart pounded. The law, the registry, the certification, none of it had stopped her. She had crossed the line and laughed while doing it. Worse, she had turned it into a spectacle online and people were watching. Hundreds, maybe thousands, sharing it, commenting, liking. Eric was silent in the comments now, no agreement, no defense, just avoidance. It was personal. I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about the table anymore. This was about power. She wanted to assert control over my family, my son, my legacy. She wasn't apologetic, she was aggressive. She was daring me, daring the law, daring history itself. And that's when I noticed it. In the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was the small tag I had attached to the table when I registered it. Not just any tag, a certified metal plate with a QR code linked to the historical registry. I hadn't made it obvious, but it was there, etched permanently. That's when the first twist hit me. Marissa had unwittingly broadcast herself committing a violation of federal and state regulations. She didn't know it, but the moment that video went online, she had created evidence. She had documented herself destroying protected property. And the best part, she had done it voluntarily, thinking she was mocking me. I downloaded the video immediately. I timestamped it. I logged the URL. I saved every comment, every share, every reaction. She had just handed me everything I needed for leverage. I didn't have to go to her, I didn't have to confront her, and I didn't have to raise my voice. The law, my documentation, and her own arrogance would do the work for me. Then came the sickening realization. Eric was complicit. He hadn't stopped her. He hadn't even questioned it. His silence wasn't protection, it was permission. My own son, who I had trusted to value family and legacy, had abandoned both, and that hurt more than the paint ever could. By the evening, I had a plan that wasn't just legal, it was surgical. I could freeze the table, restrict its use, enforce penalties, and escalate to fines. But I realized something even more satisfying. I could make this public. I could make Marissa's disregard for history and respect an object lesson she couldn't ignore. And then the final layer of the twist fell into place. By destroying the table in her video, she had inadvertently triggered a clause in the historical registry I hadn't originally planned to use. Any damage to the artifact automatically invoked a mandatory assessment by a certified appraiser, including potential restitution. Essentially, her own hands had initiated the first stage of her financial and social accountability. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it settle. I hadn't touched a thing. I hadn't made a scene. She had just set the trap herself. And when Eric finally called that night, begging me to, "Please don't make this into a big deal," I realized he had already lost, and so had she. Because from this point forward, every move they made would be predictable. Every reaction would play into the plan I had already built. And the next morning, that's when the real game began. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my workbench, staring at the empty space where the table had once been. The smell of sawdust still clung to my garage, and the hum of the old fluorescent light overhead kept me focused. I began mapping out my next steps. This wasn't just about the table anymore. This was about respect, accountability, and the long game. First, I needed leverage beyond the registry. The law could freeze the table, require restitution, and even involve fines, but that alone wouldn't reach them where it hurt. I needed social, legal, and psychological pressure all at once. I reviewed Marissa's posts, her stories, her Instagram highlights. Every video she had uploaded over the past year told me more about her character than 1,000 conversations ever could. She craved validation. She thrived on appearances. Every like, every comment, every share was a thread I could pull. Then I looked at Eric. He was stuck between loyalty to his wife and some faint memory of the family he grew up in. That weakness would make him pliable. He wasn't the target, he was the collateral, but he could be used to amplify the effect. I drafted a 3-step plan. Step 1, enforcement. I would formally notify them that the table was now legally protected and that her modifications constituted a violation. Certified letters, copies to Eric, evidence of the violation attached. I wanted them to realize immediately that this wasn't just an opinion, it was enforceable, documented, and undeniable. Step 2. Public accountability. I would reach out to the registry appraiser and provide a statement documenting the destruction she had caused. With photographs, timestamps, and her own video as evidence, this would create a permanent record. I didn't want humiliation for the sake of humiliation. I wanted recognition of wrongdoing that couldn't be ignored. Step 3. Psychological leverage. I needed them to feel the consequences in the home itself, the space they considered theirs. I drafted a letter explaining that under the registry, the table could not be moved, altered, or painted without permission. Violations could result in fines or legal action. Effectively, it would make the table untouchable, an immovable reminder of their misjudgment, and because it had sentimental value to them, it would sting in a way money alone never could. But here, where I added the twist no one would anticipate, I wasn't just going to rely on the registry's power, I was going to make the table a living trap. Using a discrete tracking system, I could monitor the table's movement, its condition, and ensure any further tampering would trigger automatic legal escalation. It was surgical. I double-checked every detail. I called the lawyer handling the registry filing. Everything was airtight. If they tried to contest it, they would face mountains of evidence. If they ignored it, the registry would act independently. Either way, they were boxed in. By the time dawn broke, I had drafted letters, coordinated with the appraiser, and set up the monitoring system. My hands were steady, my mind focused. There was no rage in what I planned, only precision, the kind born of years of shaping wood to exact specifications. When I finally sent the first certified letter, I felt a calm satisfaction wash over me. This wasn't just revenge, it was teaching a lesson about respect, about legacy, about consequences. And I knew deep down that once Marissa read that letter, the panic would hit immediately. Eric would see it too, and the first cracks in their carefully curated life would begin to show. I leaned back, looking at the empty garage, and whispered to myself, history isn't just made, it's defended. By mid-morning, my plan was in motion. I just had to wait for the reactions, and when they came, they would be even better than I imagined. The next morning, the fallout hit faster than I expected. Marissa had opened the certified letters, 2 of them, and instantly called Eric in a panic. I could hear the trembling in her voice through the brief voicemail he left on my phone. Dad, I don't know what to do. They're threatening fines, the registry, everything. It's insane. Eric's voice was tight, hesitant, defensive, like he didn't know whether to protect her or finally see what I had been trying to preserve all along. But then came the second twist, one I hadn't even anticipated, but that I realized could change everything. As Marissa panicked, she didn't just contact Eric. She posted again, this time a desperate story asking for advice on a ruined antique table. The registry and all legal language were clearly documented in her messages, but in the process, she inadvertently revealed the truth. The table had been inherited from the barn planks, handcrafted and historically significant. Suddenly, friends, followers, and a few antique experts began commenting, resharing, and identifying it as potentially extremely valuable. She thought she could control the narrative. She thought she could dismiss me as overreacting. But the world was paying attention now. Every single post she made was another layer of evidence, and she had built it herself. Then Eric finally broke down. In a panicked voice, he admitted something I hadn't realized. The table wasn't just sentimental. They had already invested in the repainting and refinishing, counting it as a design upgrade on insurance and social media. They had unknowingly put themselves in legal jeopardy. By trying to improve the table's aesthetic, they had also created financial exposure. Every step she had taken to fix it now played directly into my hands. And here's the second twist that sealed everything. Unbeknownst to both of them, I had also taken out a small, discreet insurance appraisal of the table before it was shipped. That appraisal declared the table irreplaceable and valued it far beyond standard market price because of its provenance and reclaimed historical wood. If Marissa attempted any further alteration, or even tried to remove the paint, I could pursue civil restitution for the full appraised value. Every misstep became legally binding, financially devastating, and socially humiliating. At that point, I didn't need to do anything else. She had trapped herself. She had handed me every tool I needed for total accountability. And Eric, who had once agreed that it looked better now, could do nothing to protect her without implicating himself. By midday, the situation escalated further. Antique forums and historical interest groups began contacting Marissa directly, curious about the table's origin. Followers questioned her authenticity, and some even offered expert opinions about the damage to historically significant reclaimed wood. I watched quietly as she tried to defend herself, floundering. Every word she typed made her situation worse. I leaned back in my chair at the garage, savoring the symmetry of it. She had painted over a piece of history in an attempt to assert control and appear stylish. She had broadcast it online, documented it herself, and now the table had become untouchable. Every post, every action she took to fix the problem only tightened the legal and social noose. And yet the most satisfying part wasn't the legal angle, nor the financial one. It was watching her realization dawn, the moment when she understood that what she thought was her triumph, her clever makeover, had backfired spectacularly. By that evening, she had finally stopped posting. Eric called me, voice tight and trembling. "Dad, she's scared. She doesn't know what to do. Can we fix this?" I didn't answer, I just smiled quietly to myself. Because I had one final move left, one final revelation that neither of them would see coming. And when I executed it, it would guarantee that the lesson, the respect for history, for family, for effort, would stick permanently. I knew it wasn't enough for Marissa and Eric to simply feel guilt or fear. They needed to understand why the table mattered, why the violation cut so deep, and why it couldn't just be painted over like some meaningless object. That's when I sent the next letter, hand-delivered this time by a courier to make it undeniable. Inside was a detailed account, the history of the barn, the age of the wood, the work my father and I had done to salvage it, and every night I had spent sanding, joining, and polishing it until it felt alive under my hands. I included photographs, letters from antique experts confirming its authenticity, and a copy of my father's journal referencing the planks and their symbolic significance to our family. But the kicker, the part that made it truly personal, was the section explaining the children. I had etched very quietly the initials of my grandchildren into the underside of the table. They had never seen it. They would grow up one day, visit Denver, and wonder why a new table seemed slightly ordinary. The real history, the story embedded in the wood, was invisible unless you knew where to look. I explained that Marissa's paint job had literally buried their heritage, their connection to family, and the labor of generations. She hadn't just ruined a table, she had erased the memory of my father, of summers in that barn, of the roots that Eric and his children came from. I didn't ask her to unpaint it. I didn't plead. I just documented it, made it undeniable. And then I told them the truth about what the law allowed me to do. Any further attempts to repaint, alter, or move the table would trigger automatic civil penalties, fines, and restitution. The legal protections weren't there to punish them out of spite, they existed to preserve the integrity of the artifact. Eric was silent on the phone. He couldn't argue. He hadn't really understood the weight of legacy until that moment. And Marissa, she knew, in a way she couldn't ignore, that she had stepped over a line she didn't fully comprehend until it was too late. I didn't feel relief or triumph yet. This wasn't revenge finished, it was preparation. But I did feel satisfaction in the inevitability of consequences. History, respect, and craftsmanship had a weight that no social media post or modern aesthetic could erase. That night I went back to my garage and ran my hands over my old workbench. I thought of my father, of the barn, of the smell of sawdust mixing with the hot Ohio air during summers when the world felt simple and just. I realized the most important reason for all this wasn't the table. It was teaching Eric, teaching Marissa, teaching my grandchildren that some things deserve protection, recognition, and patience. Some things don't belong to the fleeting whims of social media or convenience. And that's when I decided the final move had to be perfect. It couldn't just be legal or financial. It had to be undeniable, visible, and unerasable. They needed to feel the presence of what they had destroyed, and understand, once and for all, that some things aren't theirs to manipulate. By dawn, the plan was ready. It would use their own home, their own furniture arrangement, their own daily lives as the stage. Every step they took from that point on would reinforce the lesson, whether they liked it or not. And when it was complete, the table would stand as both a symbol of what they had lost and a permanent reminder of who held the real power in that story. Because this wasn't just about paint, or Instagram likes, or even legalities. This was about respect, about history, about making sure the next generation would understand that heritage, effort, and memory weren't disposable. And they wouldn't forget it. The final move had to be subtle, devastating, and irreversible. I didn't want anger. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted acknowledgement, the kind that comes when someone realizes they've crossed a line they can't undo. I arranged for a professional historical appraiser and a certified installer to come to their home under the guise of routine registry verification. They arrived early on a Tuesday morning. Marissa and Eric were confused but tried to act casual. The moment the appraiser stepped inside, he went straight for the table. He examined the paint, the wood, and the joints. Then he looked at Marissa with a quiet, disappointed expression. "This piece is irreplaceable," he said. "It's not just a table. It's reclaimed historical wood from a barn that dates back over a century. The damage you've done can't be reversed without destroying its value entirely." Marissa froze, Eric's face drained of color. Next, the installer pulled out a set of small, discreet locks and brackets I had prearranged. The table was literally secured in place. Legs, top and all. Any attempt to move it would trigger alarms with the registry office and automatically notify the legal authorities. They couldn't touch it, repaint it, or rearrange it. It was theirs in name only, but untouchable in reality. Then came the piece de resistance. I had asked the installer to flip the table over to reveal the underside. There, etched into the wood and sealed beneath a thin protective layer, were the initials of my grandchildren, names Marissa and Eric had never seen. The message was clear. The legacy, the history, the family memory could not be destroyed, no matter how loud they shouted or how many layers of paint they applied. Marissa gasped. Eric stepped back. The appraiser handed them the report, complete with photographs, legal references, and restitution terms. "You've been given custody of a historical artifact," he said. "Any further alterations or attempts to move it without authorization will result in penalties up to the full appraised value, plus legal fees." The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. Their attempts to assert control, to modernize the table, to prove taste or authority, they had failed spectacularly. They were trapped in their own home with a monument to the very history they had tried to erase. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to justify myself. The table did it all. Every scratch, every mark, every grain told the story of what they had tried to destroy, and of the work, love, and memory they could never touch. Over the next few weeks, I monitored their social media. The posts dwindled. Comments asking for design tips went unanswered. The table became a silent witness in their dining room, untouchable and undeniable. Eric stopped agreeing with her on aesthetic choices. He stopped defending the online comments. He realized, finally, that legacy couldn't be erased with paint or arrogance. And me, I returned to my garage, to the smell of sawdust and unfinished planks, and finally felt the weight lift off my chest. This wasn't vengeance born of anger. This was justice born of foresight, precision, and respect for what truly matters. Marissa learned her lesson the hard way. Eric, too, and the grandchildren. One day they would see that table, run their hands along its grain, and know that someone in their family, someone who loved them and honored the past, had protected their heritage. The table stood in Denver, untouchable, unpainted, and unforgotten. A quiet monument to patience, history, and the idea that some things are sacred, even when the world tries to dismiss them. And I watched it all unfold from Columbus, Ohio, knowing that I had won in the most complete way possible, not by breaking them, but by ensuring the table, and the story it carried, would never be erased.